This is a real special treat here at the Art Museum, and I'm so thankful for the Art Museum that it exists here on campus and the way that it enriches what we do, what we study, how we think about who we are. When I was a new student here, a freshman, I lived up in Deseret Towers, which of course don't exist anymore. They're up on the hill where the dorms are now, the new Heritage Halls. And my walk to campus every day was down right by here. And it was during that freshman year that they started digging the hole that just kept getting deeper and deeper and deeper. I don't know, it's fun that we're standing in that hole, here today, and what that has become and what that means to so many of us. There's been so many great exhibits that come through here, and this is one that was a little bit unexpected to me, and the connections and the way that I connected to it was a little bit unexpected as well. What I want to do in the short time that I have today is go through some items from the exhibit that stood out to me in the context, in a particular context. And I'm going to try and give you a certain frame that you might think of looking at these. I don't think it's the only frame that you could use to do it. I think that there's a lot of different ways that we might approach this, and undoubtedly we'll hear this from our different panelists today who are approaching this all from different perspectives. But I want you to begin by thinking broadly, taking a little bit of a step back and asking the question, what is nature, right? Is this a term that we can take for granted? And especially in the kind of, in the context of Western culture, this idea has developed in very specific ways. And in fact, if you go far enough back, and you don't have to go really that far back, the idea of nature that you might have in your head today likely didn't exist 400 years ago, right? That the way that the word nature was used wasn't used to denote the kinds of things that we've come to associate with nature. And so part of my work as a scholar of the environmental humanities is to try to tease out what are some of the assumptions that we make, and what are some of the blind spots that are perhaps created. And anytime that we kind of work within a paradigm, it helps us to see certain things really well. But of course, that always comes by deciding not to focus on other things. And that sometimes is a good trade-off, and sometimes, like I said, it creates a blind spot for us. And it's, you don't need me or any of our other panelists to tell you that we live in an age of true environmental crisis. And a lot of the crises that we face are symptoms of a greater problem that have to do with our relationship to the environment, to the natural world, to the non-human world, and maybe even to our relationship to ourselves, that is precisely caused by some of these blind spots. Okay? So as a way of getting into this, I thought I would wander like way outside of an area that I have any expertise in at all. Okay, perhaps some of you remember from your geology class, once upon a time, this idea of how we've kind of tried to understand the different historical epochs of the Earth, right, and the way that different layers hold within it, kind of within the actual physical geology of the Earth, the history of how the Earth came to look the way that it did. And if you were a stratigrapher, this kind of the sub-discipline within geology, that your study would be to try to fix in the layers of rock those moments where you could actually see transitions from one era to the next. And this is an example of how this is done. This is a picture that's coming from South Australia, and you see these different layers of rock. And they represent kind of a transition between different epochs here. And by studying the chemical compositions of the rock and the way that the rock is laid down, they've put this golden spike, and this isn't the only one. There's many of these all over the world. But to put this golden spike to try to define, this transition between these two eras. There's some kind of evidence in the rock here that makes this boundary point evident. Now, I present this to you for your consideration to think a little bit about what geologic epoch do we inhabit? What epoch, of the Earth? Technically speaking, it's referred to as the Holocene, right? It's this kind of recent warming period of the last 10,000 or so years. That's been, the textbook definition. But there have been those in the last few years who have invited us to maybe rethink this. And to rethink, the importance of rethinking this is to better understand the place of the human within this geologic history, okay? As a species, Homo sapiens have only been around for a couple 100,000 years. And the history of the Earth, of course, is far, far, far older than that. And it's a way of trying to understand our place within that. One of these people was Paul Crutzen, who's an atmospheric chemist, and he very famously in Nature, this isn't the first appearance of this, but famously in an article in Nature in 2002, presented this idea of the Anthropocene, okay? And the way that he frames it, this is the first and last paragraph from this short article. And he points in this first paragraph to all of these different, sorts of things that we see going on, right? Anthropogenic emissions of carbon dioxide, saying that global climate may depart significantly from natural behavior for many millennia to come. And of course, he's dead on this. He's saying this in 2002, and all the evidence since 2002 has just corroborated what he was already pointing to. And he says, it seems appropriate to assign the term Anthropocene to the present. In many ways, human-dominated geological epoch, supplementing the Holocene. And this idea of the Anthropocene, for him, he says you could place this, this date around the Industrial Revolution, right, with the advent of the steam engine, where we start burning fossil fuels with a fury in a different kind of way. Paul Crutzen and others who threw out this idea of the Anthropocene, the idea was that we need to stop thinking of humans as being outside of nature. Humans are embedded in nature. They're part of nature, and yet the Western conception, particularly of this, that has developed over the last few hundred years, has been that somehow that we stand outside of that. So when I was talking about nature earlier, and the image that maybe was conjured up in your head, were you thinking of people? Were you thinking of this room as being natural in some kind of way? Everything, here, even the synthetic fabrics and things like that you're sitting on, they go back to something somewhere, right? Some kind of manipulation of things that were extracted from the earth in some kind of way. But we don't tend to think of it that way, do we? And while I think that there's problems with Crutzen's specific articulation in this article, which we kind of get to here at the end, which I'll point to, it nonetheless is really productive in thinking about how are we involved in and a part of nature? How are we even ourselves a kind of natural force, right? One of the primal forces that I think are being represented in this exhibit. One way of representing this, and Ben, I promise I'm going to stop talking about science, which I have no business doing really, right? One way of representing this is this notion of planetary boundaries, just to kind of get an idea of when we talk about an age of environmental crisis and humans as kind of actors in kind of global systems, what we're talking about. A group of scientists came up with this idea of a way of visualizing and wrapping our heads around this. And the basic premise behind what they were working with is we have all of these different sorts of threats, that threats to biodiversity. We have problems going with biochemical flows in the environment and climate change and all of these things. And with a lot of them, we don't actually know, because it's never happened before, like, when do we get into a really dangerous spot? Like, at what point? And so the attempt of this visualization was to say, well, we understand certain safe operating boundaries because we've observed them, right? That if we have this much carbon dioxide or greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, we know what how the atmosphere reacts to that because we've seen that. But the farther we get away from that, that we get in from the way they represent it here as a kind of a green zone, which is a safe operating zone, into these orange and red zones where, in a lot of cases, we don't actually know what will happen. We just know that it's unprecedented, and we can make predictions, based on studies that we've done about what might happen, but it puts us in dangerous territory. Now, the argument against these is that, well, if you set up a boundary like this, you're making this argument that, well, one step past somehow puts you, over the top or something like that, and that's not always what I think it's intended to mean, but it's a good way of kind of visualizing, and you see, as they've done this, and they've released several reports over the last a couple decades, how we're moving at an alarming rate in some of these areas. And if you can make out the text here, it's showing things like climate change, fresh water use. I mentioned the biochemical flows and biodiversity. Some of these kinds of things. Like humans are exerting this pressure on natural systems that is completely unprecedented. How Crutzen ended his discussion in this article was making this call for recognizing how, I'll quote him. He says, "A daunting task lies ahead for scientists and engineers to guide society towards environmentally sustainable management during the era of the Anthropocene. By relabeling this era, the era of the Anthropocene, that we recognize ourselves as participants in this." And for Crutzen, he argues for this very active participation, right? Maybe even, as he says in the next sentence here, this will require appropriate human behavior at all scales and may well involve internationally accepted large-scale geoengineering projects, for instance, to optimize climate, okay? Whenever I hear geoengineering, I get really scared because we've got a really bad track record of actually understanding what the impacts of our actions are. But what I think is valuable coming out of this is this idea, if we think about ourselves as participants, as opposed to standing outside of it, there's actually something really productive about that. And for me, as a Latter-day Saint, this idea of the stewardship that I've been given seems to speak exactly to this principle, right? It's not that I don't use nature, I'm not a part of nature or natural systems at all, that somehow I stand outside of it. I am hopelessly embedded in nature, right? I'm dependent on the environment for the air I breathe, for the water I drink, for the food that I eat. Every aspect of my physical and I would even argue spiritual well-being is tied up with the environment. And I think that this is by design, okay? That God has both given me this great gift and also this responsibility and power. I can change the environment around me, and collectively even more so. But it's this great responsibility that comes that seems to be what Crutzen is actually arguing for, and is a little bit different than how we've thought about environmentalism for the last 50 or so years, where environmentalism for the last 50 years has tended to focus on nature as a sacred kind of space that should be kept separate from humans. Humans are the problem, and we've had a difficult time imagining human participation kind of within the natural world. So with all this as a background, I want to jump in now just very briefly to some of the works here that I think that we can begin to think of as Anthropocene art, okay? And when we think of Anthropocene art, one of the places that I always start, because we're in Utah, is with Robert Smithson's Spiral Jetty. Hopefully, this is something that you've had a chance to go and to visit, and it so well encapsulates a lot of the principles that I think that we can think of in the exhibit here today. This, of course, is made in 1970. It's a great example of kind of this earthwork. He gets bulldozers and goes and he starts to, in a very destructive way, actually makes this 1,500-foot jetty on the north arm of the Great Salt Lake. And it's interesting how this work of art draws us to this place, to a place that very few people would otherwise go. It's kind of desolate. It's kind of in some ways, there's these kind of remnants of oil exploration and things like that. And this fascinated him about this place, something that was rugged and wild, yet at the same time had all of these evidences of human presence. In some cases, going back tens of thousands of years. This has been a really important, place for Native Americans for a long time, and he kind of gathers it together in this interesting kind of way. Now, more recently, people have come to think of it as environmental art, and it's environmental art only in the sense that it is in the environment. It was horribly destructive, actually, right? And you see, the images of him when he's building it. It's with these bulldozers and things like that. But he really wanted to build something that would eventually kind of blend back into the landscape and kind of disappear in some kinds of ways. He was interested in this idea of active participation, and with the recent history of the lake, right, levels that first were rising during the 1980s, it completely submerged the jetty for years and years. And now I think the jetty hasn't been a jetty since around 2014, 2015, that the level of the lake has receded so far. This picture was taken in 2018, and I think that the lake is hundreds and hundreds of meters away from the shoreline now, because especially that north arm has receded to such a degree. But I'm thankful for it because it draws us to that place and to some of the issues that the lake is facing. So with all that as a background, let me to take you through a few of the artworks that really stood out to me and for what I thought that they had to say about this idea of Anthropocene art. If we were just to start here with Holly Brackman's Desolation Relief, and you'll have to forgive me, I'm going to go somewhat quickly through this. I'm not an expert on textile art, so that's one of the reasons why I kind of decided to take the approach that I did. But so it'll end up being a little bit more of an overview than kind of an in-depth dissection of each work. What really stuck out to me with this quilt is the way that it invites us to think about how art is a representation of place and the way that a map is, right? Now, we have different expectations that we place on a map in terms of the correspondence between what we see on the map and what we see in terms of the physical geography. But the whole idea of a map is it's predicated on this relationship. And this quilt takes up this idea by presenting us kind of a topographical, we don't expect to see that in a work of textile art necessarily, but it points to this kind of relationship that a lot of these works have in that they're representing something that's there, that's something that's out there. And there's a way that we get this also in Vicki Connolly's Slot Canyon. It's presenting us something, but in doing so, it's not the thing itself, and it's not a kind of a straightforwardly mimetic representation of it either. It's always changed, right? And so this is presenting us a slot canyon. And if you've been in a slot canyon before, I think you recognize what it is that's being communicated here in terms of the way that the light bounces around in these interesting ways, that you get this interesting kind of geometry that that the rock presents itself almost not as rock, and so that what you can do through art is that you highlight some of these aspects, so that when we go back to a slot canyon, we view it differently, having seen this quilt, right? And I just think it's an absolute, kind of marvelous way that it brings together, almost as if it's alive, right? It looks like it's fire almost, burning. And it changes then how we go back and see these things. Sarah Ann Smith's Rosehip stuck out to me because of this kind of nod back to the idea of a still life. And that, again, we look at this, we can't help but get absorbed by the incredible artistry in the stitches and the way that this all kind of comes together with this really interesting engagement that toggles between a rose hip and fabric representing a rose hip. And the way that there's no kind of mistaking looking at the quilt for a kind of a photograph or kind of something that's more straightforwardly, like I said, mimetic, that it looks exactly like it. But when we go back to this object, it's placed us in a different relationship with it, so that we would see a rose hip differently, right? That it accentuates texture and color in a unique kind of way. This is one of the powers of art. Okay, so art that provides this kind of perspective. Okay, the next dimension that I wanted to focus on was the way that this particular medium is able to highlight materiality. And we see this, I think, in a really spectacular way, particularly in Janet Windsor's Crumbling, that incorporates not only layers and layers of fabric, but also rocks as well, right, that are, I promise I have not touched, but I am so tempted to kind of touch and to feel this, right? That it's inviting this kind of tactile engagement with the work of art itself. And I think that this is significant, particularly in this age where there is such a discussion about artificial intelligence and kind of digital media, and that so much of our consumption of art is mediated through digital means. And so to go through the gallery and to have this kind of engagement, kind of more tactile, insistently material sort of art form in front of us is an important corrective, I think, for this over-reliance or this kind of overemphasis sometimes on the digital. Something else that I really appreciate about the art that we see here that ties back into some of the key ideas of the Anthropocene, Liz mentioned in her introduction, and that is that quilts are the ultimate recyclers, right? That it's this repurposing of materials that maybe were used in a different context or being brought together in an interesting and unique kind of way. And we get this in Kathy Menzies' Growth, Decay, and Renewal, right? Where it's focusing on the cyclical nature of nature. Nature and the environment does not run in just kind of one direction. Cycles are much more important, and so too the materials that are being used in these artworks are being used in that same kind of way. That there's a different, it's a correction to the more linear notion of time. This is highlighted in another way in Maggie Vanderwhite's Earth to Earth, where the materials themselves are demonstrating the kind of decay that all materials go through, but decay is always about a recycling. If we talk about this in terms of natural systems, here the moth-eaten fabric that she takes and incorporates into the work of art itself is kind of reminding us of this kind of cyclical nature as something that is was, on the one hand, damage suddenly now becomes a work of art for us to contemplate and to think about, and this recycling is an enacting of the kind of thing that we see going on in natural systems all the time. The forces of creation are highlighted in works like that of Betty Busby's Fault Line. These, and of course the title of the exhibit itself, is pointing to these sorts of things. But one of the challenges that we have as humans is and especially as we think about this through the Anthropocene, is the way that scale challenges us, both spatial scales and temporal scales. We have a really hard time thinking outside the reference of our own body and our own body's existence and the kind of time frames that our body tends to inhabit when we structure our days and weeks and even years. What is a year? If we start thinking in terms of geologic time, and how do we begin to kind of stretch our comprehension of these sorts of scales. And it's interesting how each of the artifacts here in the exhibit deal with the question of scale differently. And I like this particular one because what is it that we're actually seeing? It's difficult to tell whether this is, a kind of a continental rift, zone, kind of major, kind of gap, or is this a small crack in the earth, right? That we have no kind of frame of being able to see this, and each of these artifacts kind of tackle this in a different kind of way. I'm particularly taken by Shin-Hee Chin's The Web of Life, Earth, because I think it gets at one of the key concepts of the Anthropocene, which has to do with connectedness. Now, of course, all of the quilts are made up of threads that are used to bind things together and to connect things in different sorts of ways. This highlights the presence of the threads in a unique kind of way and points us in this direction about thinking about the way that things are connected and the difficult notion of coming up with hard borders. Again, one of the things that the Anthropocene emphasizes is the way that all things are connected, right? We can't think of ourselves outside of the natural systems. We're always inside of them. We're always embedded in them. And any kinds of definitions that we come up have to be thought of as being somewhat provisional because of this radical interconnectedness of things. And I love the way that you can't find the end of a thread in this, right? That it kind of goes through the whole thing and it connects them all. Okay. Lastly, these pairings of quilts I thought really stood out too, because they seem to point towards the way that we tend to some of the really iconic images of the Anthropocene. Of course, anytime we talk about icebergs and ice, that we're confronted with the melting of polar ice caps and the implications that will have for us here, and representing ice itself is never a neutral sort of thing nowadays. It's always seems to be engaged in this conversation. We can't think of it outside of that. And so too, something like Brenda Smith's Glen Canyon too. What I particularly like about this quilt is not only the way that it kind of brings color and geometry together in a kind of iconic representation of Lake Powell behind Glen Canyon Dam, but that in so doing, it's showing that bathtub ring that has existed in Lake Powell for years now, and this has been caused, of course, by the declining water here in the West. That we've been in a prolonged drought. Last winter's water helped to remedy this only somewhat. There's so many things that are wrapped up in this. On the one hand, this is a beautiful image, as Lake Powell is a beautiful, kind of place. But the dam that created Lake Powell, of course, did incredible damage to an area that many, including Edward Abbey, thought of as being beautiful and worthy of the kind of protection we typically afford to national parks. It came at great cost. And there's not a commentary, there's not a kind of a direct commentary on if this is a good or a bad thing in this work of art. And I think that this is the sign of good art, actually, something that draws our attention, to something that allows us to kind of draw our own conclusions. In some ways, it reminds me of the artwork of another exhibit that was here at the museum a few years ago, the photographs of Edward Burtynsky, where he likewise photographs more industrial landscapes a lot of times. And there's something aesthetically beautiful about them, right? They draw us kind of in, and yet they also invite us to consider, well, what's the price? At what cost do these things come? So I'd just like to conclude, coming back to Crutzen again. He wrote this a few years later, I think maybe tempering his earlier position a little bit. But he makes this claim about that it's no longer us against nature, right? That we need to start thinking about this in a different kind of way. To master this huge shift, he's saying that we must change the way we perceive ourselves and our role in the world. And he goes through this kind of argument again about thinking about the Anthropocene. Rather than representing yet another sign of human hubris, this name change would stress the enormity of humanity's responsibility as stewards of the earth. It would highlight the immense power of our intellect and our creativity and the opportunities they offer for shaping the future. Art is a powerful kind of creative engagement with nature and the way that we think about our relationship. It both mirrors the relationship we have, but as well, it helps to drive the conversation in a different direction. It helps us to see with new eyes and to see with new possibilities. And that's one of the things that I find particularly engaging about this exhibit, is the way that it invites us to do that by, for me, engaging a medium that I wasn't that familiar with, certainly not in this kind of form, and thinking about the way that thinking about my relationship with the natural world and how I can think about it in different sorts of ways. So thank you.